An 89-year-old man was humiliated when he asked for a simple sandwich at a café when the afternoon buzzed with the usual life of the café. The hiss of an espresso machine punctuated the soft hum of conversations, blending with the clinking of mugs and the rustle of newspapers. The place was warm, its inviting scent of roasted coffee wrapping around the patrons like a comforting blanket. People were scattered at wooden tables, their faces lit by laptop screens or animated smiles. For them, it was just another ordinary day. But then the door opened. It wasn't the cheery chime of the café bell that silenced the room, but the figure who stepped inside. The sound of the door creaking on its hinges seemed unnaturally loud, pulling everyone's attention. At first, no one moved. It was as if the cold air from outside had frozen the entire café for a moment. Standing in the doorway was an elderly man, hunched and frail, his thin frame almost swallowed by the oversized jacket he wore. His hands clutched the edges of the door frame, his knuckles white, as if the weight of simply stepping inside was too much. The man's name was Arthur, though no one there knew it, and his life had been anything but gentle. Arthur's clothes told his story before he could. His jacket, once sturdy and new, was now threadbare, with patches clumsily sewn over holes. His shirt, visible beneath the jacket, was yellowed with time. His shoes, if they could still be called that, were cracked and peeling, the soles nearly detached. As he shuffled forward, the café's warm light glinted off the small patches of his exposed toes, peeking out like tiny reminders of his struggles. The old man paused just inside the threshold, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The chatter resumed, but not in the same way. There were hushed whispers and sideways glances. People leaned toward one another, speaking in voices just loud enough to ensure Arthur could feel their judgment. "Poor guy," someone muttered, barely concealing a smirk. "What's he doing here?" whispered another. Arthur didn't need to hear the words to understand what was being said. He had faced that kind of disdain for years, on the streets, in crowded rooms, even in his own home long ago. But today his hunger was louder than his pride. Today he had no choice but to step into this warm, judgmental world and hope for the kindness of strangers. His steps were painfully slow, his knees creaking with each movement. His breathing was shallow, a faint wheeze accompanying the soft shuffle of his feet. As he made his way to the counter, the room seemed to grow colder. Conversations faded into murmurs, and the warmth of the café's cozy atmosphere was replaced by a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Reaching the counter felt like a victory in itself. Arthur's trembling hands reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small handful of coins. He carefully counted them, his gnarled fingers fumbling as he arranged the tarnished coins into a neat pile. He avoided looking up, his eyes fixed on the counter, as if the mere act of making eye contact might break him. Finally, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he spoke. "Excuse me," he began, his words carrying the weight of a man who rarely asked for anything. "Could I have a sandwich? The cheapest one you have, please." The café grew so quiet that the faint hum of the coffee machines felt deafening. Arthur waited, his chest rising and falling unevenly as he tried to steady his breath. His coins sat on the counter, their worth painfully small, but it was all he had. In that moment, the room held its breath. Arthur's fragile hope hung in the air like a thread, ready to snap at the slightest pull. But even in his silence, even in his vulnerability, he had no idea that his life, and the lives of everyone in that café, was about to change forever. Arthur stood at the counter, his trembling hands resting on the coins he had so carefully placed there. The café, once a lively hub of conversation, now felt eerily quiet. Every eye was on him, yet no one moved to help. For a moment, Arthur allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his request would be met with a shred of kindness. Behind the counter, however, stood someone who had no intention of offering such grace. Her name was Brenda, the café's owner, a woman known more for her sharp tongue than her coffee-making skills. Her apron, once white but now stained with streaks of coffee, was tied tightly around her waist. Brenda glanced down at Arthur's small pile of coins, then up at him, her eyes narrowing. "That's it," she said, her voice cold and cutting, loud enough for the entire café to hear. Arthur's shoulders hunched even further, as if her words had weight. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He nodded instead, his head dipping slightly. Brenda crossed her arms, her expression one of complete disdain. "This isn't a soup kitchen, old man," she snapped, each word landing like a slap. "If you don't have enough money, you don't get to eat here." A few chuckles rippled through the café. Arthur's face burned with humiliation, but he didn't move. His stomach growled audibly, betraying his desperation. He opened his mouth to plead, but Brenda wasn't done. "You people," she continued, shaking her head in disgust, "always thinking you can just walk in and get something for free. This is a business, not a charity." Arthur's knees felt weak. The shame, the hunger, the weight of it all, it was almost too much to bear. He steadied himself on the counter, his fingers gripping the edge as if it might hold him upright. In a voice barely above a whisper, he tried again. "Please," he said, his tone cracking with emotion. "Just something small. I'll pay with what I have." Brenda leaned in closer, her voice dripping with mockery. "Did you not hear me the first time, old man? I said no. If you don't have money, you don't belong here." The murmurs among the customers grew louder. Some whispered in discomfort. Others laughed softly at the spectacle unfolding before them. A young couple near the corner table exchanged uneasy glances, but neither made a move to intervene. A middle-aged man sipping coffee shook his head with a sarcastic smirk, muttering, "Can't believe he even tried." Arthur's throat tightened. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he forced them back. Crying wouldn't help him now. He stared at the coins on the counter, his last hope. His entire world seemed to shrink down to that small pile of tarnished metal. Finally, Brenda sighed dramatically and waved her hand as if shooing away a fly. "Go on, get out of here," she said. "We don't serve your kind." Her words struck like a hammer. Arthur stood frozen, unable to move. For a moment he felt as if the entire world had turned against him. His fingers twitched, hovering over the coins, but he didn't pick them up. His dignity told him to walk away, but his hunger begged him to stay. And then, from the corner of the café, someone cleared their throat. It was a subtle sound, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Brenda's words faltered as her eyes darted toward the source of the interruption. The café patrons turned their heads, curious. At the back of the room, a woman rose from her seat. She was striking, not because of her beauty, but because of the aura she carried. Her name was Evelyn, and there was something about her that demanded attention. Dressed in a sleek navy blazer and matching slacks, her polished appearance contrasted sharply with the gritty scene that had just unfolded. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her sharp brown eyes were fixed on Brenda. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "What exactly is going on here?" The café fell silent once more. Brenda straightened, clearly flustered by the woman's presence. Evelyn's gaze shifted to Arthur, who stood trembling at the counter, and something in her expression softened. "Is this how you treat people?" Evelyn asked, her tone growing firmer. She stepped forward, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoing in the quiet room. "Because if it is, I think you've forgotten what it means to run a business," Brenda stammered, trying to regain her composure, but Evelyn raised a hand to stop her. Then, turning to Arthur, she smiled gently and said, "Don't worry. Today, your meal is on me." The room buzzed with quiet murmurs. Evelyn's words hung in the air, a lifeline for Arthur and a challenge to Brenda. No one quite knew what would happen next, but one thing was certain. The moment had shifted, and the story was far from over. Arthur stood motionless, the weight of Brenda's words pressing down on him like a physical force. He felt as though the walls of the café were closing in, the stifling atmosphere suffocating any last shred of hope he had. His trembling hands rested on the counter, hovering over the coins he had worked so hard to collect, and for a fleeting moment he wondered if he should just turn around and leave. But before he could make a move, Evelyn's voice cut through the tension like a clap of thunder. "Excuse me," she said again, louder this time, her tone crisp and commanding. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the counter, each step exuding an air of confidence that silenced the murmurs around her. Every head in the room turned to watch as she made her way toward the scene, her presence alone shifting the dynamic in the room. Brenda turned to face her, her earlier bravado suddenly faltering. She recognized Evelyn instantly. Everyone did. Evelyn Reynolds wasn't just any customer, she was the Evelyn Reynolds, the woman who owned several of the city's most successful boutiques. She was known not only for her wealth, but for her unshakable confidence and sharp wit. "Evelyn," Brenda stammered, a forced smile creeping onto her face. "What brings you here today?" Evelyn ignored the question. Instead, her piercing gaze moved to Arthur. She took in every detail: the frail frame, the trembling hands, the faded jacket that barely shielded him from the cold. Her eyes softened, but only for a moment. Then she turned back to Brenda, her expression hardening like stone. "Did I hear you correctly just now?" Evelyn asked, her voice calm but tinged with unmistakable authority. "You refuse to serve this man?" Brenda hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining her pride and trying to placate one of her most influential customers. "Well, you see, Evelyn," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "he doesn't have enough money to pay. This is a business, after all. We can't just—" Evelyn raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Save it," she said sharply. "What I just witnessed was not the behavior of someone running a business. It was the behavior of someone who has forgotten what it means to treat people with basic decency." The cafe went silent again. All eyes were on Evelyn now, and the tension in the air was palpable. Brenda's cheeks flushed a deep red, but she squared her shoulders, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Look," Brenda said defensively, her tone losing its earlier confidence. "It's not personal, but if he can't pay, he can't eat. That's how it works." Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not personal," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You humiliated a man in front of a room full of strangers. You mocked him when all he asked for was the simplest act of kindness. If that's not personal, I don't know what is." Arthur, still standing at the counter, felt a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't used to being defended, especially not by someone like Evelyn. Her words, so firm and unapologetic, made his heart ache with gratitude, but also with disbelief. Why would someone like her stand up for someone like him? Evelyn turned to Arthur and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Sir," she said softly, her voice now carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with her earlier tone, "don't worry about a thing. Today, your meal is on me. Order whatever you'd like." Arthur's lips quivered as he tried to form a response, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She turned back to Brenda, her expression hard and unyielding. "Let me make one thing very clear," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "If you ever treat another human being the way you just treated this man, I will make sure everyone in this city knows exactly what kind of business you're running here. Do I make myself clear?" Brenda's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. She nodded stiffly, her earlier arrogance now replaced by visible discomfort. The tension in the cafe was thick enough to cut with a knife. The customers, who had moments ago been content to whisper and watch from the sidelines, now looked on with a mix of awe and unease. Some exchanged guilty glances, perhaps realizing their own complicity and remaining silent. Evelyn wasn't done yet. She turned to the room at large, her voice carrying an edge of defiance. "I don't know about the rest of you," she said, "but I refuse to live in a world where kindness is treated as a weakness. This man walked in here today because he needed help, and instead of compassion, he was met with cruelty." The room was silent. No one dared to speak. Evelyn's words hung in the air, heavy with truth and unspoken challenge. Then, with the grace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, Evelyn pulled out her wallet. She placed a crisp bill on the counter, far more than the cost of any meal, and slid it toward Brenda. "This will cover his meal," she said firmly. "And if you have a shred of decency left, you'll apologize." Brenda swallowed hard, her face pale. She looked at Arthur, who stood with his head bowed, and muttered, "I'm sorry." The words sounded hollow, but they were enough for now. Arthur looked up, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Evelyn smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Just eat your meal and take care of yourself. That's all I ask." As she stepped back from the counter, the cafe began to stir again. Conversations resumed, but there was a different energy in the air now, one of quiet reflection. And though Arthur's hands still trembled as he picked up his sandwich, there was something different about him, too. A glimmer of hope, faint but unmistakable, had returned to his eyes. Evelyn watched him for a moment longer, her mind already racing with thoughts. Something about this man struck her deeply, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was more than just coincidence. She didn't know it yet, but this small act of kindness was about to change her life in ways she never imagined. Arthur sat at a small table near the corner of the cafe, a plate with a freshly made sandwich placed delicately in front of him. His hands, still trembling, hovered over the food, hesitant as though it might disappear if he reached for it too quickly. The cafe had slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere was undeniably different. Conversations were softer now, whispers still rippling across the room, but there was no mistaking the lingering tension left by Evelyn's intervention. Evelyn, however, didn't return to her seat. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed loosely, her sharp eyes still trained on Arthur. Something about the old man had captured her attention. Not just his frailty, or the quiet dignity he tried so hard to maintain, despite the humiliation he'd endured. It was something else. As she watched him, her gaze drifted to his wrist. Peeking out from beneath the frayed sleeve of his jacket was a watch, old and battered, but oddly familiar. Evelyn blinked, her chest tightening. Could it be? She whispered to herself, her heart beginning to race. She stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the floor. Arthur noticed her approach and paused mid-bite, his eyes darting up to meet hers. He swallowed nervously, his free hand instinctively moving to cover the watch on his wrist. Evelyn offered a gentle smile, though her curiosity was burning. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly, pulling out the chair across from him. "May I sit?" Arthur hesitated, but eventually nodded. He watched as Evelyn sat gracefully, folding her hands on the table. Her presence, though calm, carried an intensity that made him feel both seen and exposed. "That watch," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "May I ask where you got it?" Arthur blinked in confusion, his brows furrowing. He glanced down at the watch, its scratched surface and worn leather strap a far cry from the polished accessories Evelyn likely wore. "This?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "It's just an old thing, nothing special." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "It is special," she said firmly. "I recognize it. Please, where did you get it?" Arthur hesitated again, his fingers lightly brushing the watch, as if he were protecting a sacred relic. After a long pause, he sighed, his voice heavy with both fondness and grief. "It belonged to my son," he said quietly. "He gave it to me years ago before he—" He stopped, his voice cracking. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. "Your son," she said, barely able to keep her voice steady. "What was his name?" Arthur's gaze dropped to the table, his hands clasping tightly together. "Elliot," he said, the name escaping his lips like a bittersweet memory. "His name was Elliot. He passed away years ago. Not a day goes by that I don't think of him." The world seemed to blur around Evelyn. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind reeling as pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle clicked into place. Elliot. The name rang through her soul like a bell, dredging up memories she thought she had buried forever. "I knew him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur's head shot up, his eyes wide with surprise. "You knew Elliot?" he asked, his voice tinged with both disbelief and desperation. Evelyn nodded slowly, her throat tightening as emotions threatened to overwhelm her. "I didn't just know him," she said, her voice cracking. "I loved him." Arthur's jaw dropped, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken pain, their shared grief filling the space like a tangible force. "He never told me about you," Arthur said finally, his voice trembling. He never said anything." Evelyn swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "We were young," she said softly, her mind flashing back to a time when Elliot's laughter had been the soundtrack to her days. "We thought we had forever, but life had other plans." Arthur shook his head, his weathered face etched with regret. "Elliot was always stubborn," he murmured. "He never wanted to burden us with his struggles. I didn't even know how much he'd kept from me until it was too late." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the café seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them and the aching void left by the man they had both loved in different ways. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "That watch," she said, her voice steadier now. "He wore it every day when we were together. I used to tease him about how old-fashioned it looked, but he'd just laugh and say it reminded him of what really mattered." Arthur smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "He said the same thing to me when he gave it to me," he said. "It was a gift from his mother, you know. After she passed, he kept it close. And after we lost him, I couldn't bear to let it go." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Arthur's. "Thank you for keeping it safe," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "It's the only piece of him I have left." Arthur stared at her for a long moment, his expression softening. "I think," he said slowly, "that maybe he'd want you to have it." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. I couldn't," she said, though her voice betrayed her longing. Arthur smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed in what felt like years. "Take it," he said. "It's not about the watch itself. It's about the memories, and I think you deserve to hold on to them as much as I do." Evelyn hesitated, but eventually she nodded. With trembling hands, Arthur unfastened the watch and handed it to her. Evelyn took it gingerly, her fingers brushing the cool metal. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks as she stared at the timepiece, her mind flooded with images of Elliot's smile, his voice, his touch. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt like a piece of her heart had been returned to her. And though the pain of losing Elliot would never truly fade, she knew that meeting Arthur wasn't an accident. It was fate. And fate, it seemed, was just beginning to weave its story. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting with Arthur was more than coincidence. The watch now felt heavy in her hand, its weight carrying not just memories but unspoken promises and unanswered questions. As they sat in silence, Arthur's shoulders slumped further, and Evelyn's thoughts raced. She realized there was one more thing she needed to do, something that couldn't wait. "Arthur," she said softly, breaking the quiet, "there's someone else we need to see." Arthur looked up, his expression puzzled. "Who?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Your wife, Elliot's mother, she deserves to know about this. About us meeting, about everything." Arthur stiffened at the mention of her. His weathered face twisted with pain, and he shook his head. "No," he said firmly, his voice trembling. "Victoria won't want to see me. She blames me for everything, for Elliot's death, for the way our lives fell apart afterward. We haven't spoken properly in years." Evelyn leaned forward, her hand reaching out to gently touch his. "Arthur, I know it's hard," she said, "but maybe this is the moment to start healing. If not for yourself, then for her, for Elliot." Arthur stared down at the table, his gnarled fingers twisting together in his lap. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Finally, he nodded, though his expression was full of doubt. "If you think it's the right thing to do," he murmured, "then I'll go. But I can't promise it'll change anything." With that, the two of them stood and left the café, Evelyn supporting Arthur as they stepped into the cold afternoon air. The streets buzzed with life, but for Arthur, the world outside felt like a distant hum. His thoughts were consumed by what lay ahead. Victoria's home was tucked away on a quiet street, its worn exterior a reflection of the life she now lived. As they approached, Arthur's pace slowed. He clutched his coat tightly around himself, as though bracing for a storm. Evelyn walked beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. When they finally reached the front door, Arthur hesitated, his hand hovering just above the weathered wood. He let out a shaky breath and turned to Evelyn. "Maybe this was a mistake," he said. Evelyn shook her head, her voice firm but kind. "You've carried this pain for too long, Arthur. It's time to face it." With a reluctant nod, Arthur knocked. The sound echoed hollowly, and for a moment it seemed no one would answer. But then the door creaked open, revealing a woman whose once proud posture had been eroded by years of grief. Victoria's eyes, sharp and piercing, despite her tired appearance, landed first on Arthur. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by something colder. Her gaze then shifted to Evelyn, her expression darkening with suspicion. "Arthur," Victoria said, her voice hoarse but still carrying a sharp edge, "what are you doing here, and who is this?" Arthur swallowed hard, his voice barely audible as he spoke. "Victoria, this is Evelyn. She—" He paused, glancing nervously at Evelyn, who stepped forward to fill the silence. "Mrs. Taylor," Evelyn said gently, "I was close to your son, Elliot. He meant the world to me." Victoria's eyes widened, her hand tightening on the edge of the door. "You're her," she said, her tone laced with bitterness. "You're the one he—" She stopped herself, shaking her head as if trying to erase the memories. "Victoria, please," Arthur said, his voice pleading. "Evelyn didn't come here to hurt you. She's here to help." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line, her body stiff as she looked between them. "Help?" she repeated bitterly. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? Can you bring my son back? Can you undo the years I've spent mourning him? The years I've spent blaming myself? And you?" Her voice cracked on the last word, but she quickly masked it with anger. Evelyn took a step closer, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I can't bring him back," she admitted, "but I can tell you the truth about who he was. I can share the memories we had together, the plans we made for a future that was taken from us. And maybe we can find a way to heal." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head stubbornly. "It's too late for that," she whispered. Arthur stepped forward then, his hands outstretched. "It's never too late, Victoria," he said softly. "I know I failed you. I failed him. But we don't have to live like this anymore. Evelyn found me today, and I think Elliot would want us to listen to her." The three of them stood there in silence, the weight of their shared grief hanging heavy in the air. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, Victoria stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice barely audible. Inside the modest living room, Victoria sat stiffly on an old armchair, while Arthur and Evelyn shared the worn-out sofa. The air was thick with tension as Evelyn began to speak, her words slow and careful. She told them about Elliot, the man she had fallen in love with, the dreams they had shared, and the heartache of losing him too soon. Her voice faltered as she recounted the last time she saw him, the regret that had haunted her ever since. Arthur and Victoria listened in silence, their expressions shifting from guarded to vulnerable as the story unfolded. When Evelyn finished, Victoria wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I blamed you," she admitted, her gaze locked on Evelyn. "I thought you took him from us. I thought you were the reason he left." Evelyn shook her head, her own tears falling freely now. "I never wanted to take him away," she said. "I loved him with everything I had, and losing him broke me too." Victoria's face softened, the anger in her eyes replaced by something far deeper, understanding. She reached out, her hand resting on Evelyn's for a brief moment before turning to Arthur. "And you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "you should have fought harder, for him, for us." Arthur bowed his head, his voice breaking as he replied. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry, but maybe we can still make things right." Victoria nodded slowly, her tears falling freely now. "Maybe we can." The silence that followed Victoria's words was heavy but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that signaled walls crumbling, wounds beginning to reopen, not to hurt, but to heal. Evelyn, Arthur, and Victoria sat together in the small, worn living room, each lost in their thoughts. The weight of shared grief filled the air, but so did something new, something fragile and unspoken. Hope. Arthur leaned back on the sofa, his frail body sinking into the cushions as he exhaled deeply. He looked older than ever, but there was a glimmer in his eyes now, a faint spark that hadn't been there before. "Victoria," he began softly, his voice wavering, "I don't deserve your forgiveness. Not after the way I failed you and Elliot, but I want to try to be better, for whatever time I have left." Victoria, sitting rigidly in her armchair, folded her hands in her lap. She didn't meet his gaze, but her posture seemed less defensive now, her sharp edges dulled by exhaustion. "I spent years angry at you, Arthur," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "Angry at myself, angry at everyone. I told myself that blaming you made it easier, but it didn't. It just made the hurt worse." Evelyn, sitting between them, watched the exchange silently. Her own heart ached as she listened, the pain of Elliot's absence fresh in her chest. She felt like an intruder in this family's grief, but at the same time, she knew she was part of it now, connected to them by love and loss. Victoria turned to Evelyn, her eyes softening. "I'm sorry," she said, the words surprising even herself. "For blaming you. For thinking you were the reason he—" Her voice broke, but she pushed through. "You weren't the reason. You were part of the happiness he had, and I see that now." Evelyn reached out, placing a gentle hand on Victoria's. "We've all carried so much guilt," she said softly, "but none of us were to blame for what happened. Elliot was his own person, and he made his choices. All we can do now is honor his memory by finding a way forward. Together." Victoria nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean into the vulnerability, letting go of the armor she had worn for so long. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn became a lifeline for Arthur and Victoria. She visited them often, bringing small comforts, a warm meal, fresh flowers, or simply her presence. Each visit chipped away at the bitterness and isolation that had consumed them, replacing it with tentative warmth. But Evelyn knew they needed more than kindness. They needed a chance to rebuild their lives, a fresh start. One crisp morning, Evelyn arrived at Victoria's house with a thick folder tucked under her arm. Arthur opened the door, his face lighting up with a faint smile as he greeted her. "Evelyn," he said, his voice still rough but warmer now. "Come in, Victoria's in the kitchen." Inside, the house felt different. The air, once heavy with sadness, now carried a sense of cautious optimism. Evelyn sat down at the small dining table, where Victoria soon joined her, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's this?" Victoria asked, eyeing the folder Evelyn placed on the table. Evelyn smiled. "It's time for the two of you to have a proper home," she said. "I've been looking at places nearby, something quiet and comfortable where you can both start over." Arthur and Victoria exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of surprise and hesitation. "We can't accept that," Arthur said finally, shaking his head. "You've already done so much for us." Evelyn leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "This isn't charity," she said. "This is about giving you both the dignity and peace you deserve. Elliot wouldn't want you living like this, struggling just to get by. He'd want you to have a chance at happiness." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached out and squeezed Evelyn's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice trembling. Over the next few days, Evelyn took them to visit several houses. They finally settled on a small, cozy home in a quiet neighborhood near a park. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect, a place where Arthur and Victoria could find peace and start anew. The day they moved in, Evelyn stood with them on the front steps, watching as they took their first steps into their new lives. Arthur turned to her, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "We wouldn't be here without you," he said. Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "You would have found your way eventually," she replied. "I just helped a little." Life in the new house brought small but meaningful changes. Arthur and Victoria began to establish routines, morning walks in the park, quiet afternoons with tea, and evenings spent reminiscing about happier times. Slowly but surely, they started to heal. One sunny afternoon, Evelyn arrived with a special guest. As Arthur and Victoria sat in their modest living room, Evelyn introduced them to a young man named Luke, a social worker she had befriended, who specialized in helping older adults reconnect with their communities. Luke's energy was infectious, and his kindness was genuine. He spent hours talking with Arthur and Victoria, helping them find ways to re-engage with the world. He even offered to teach Arthur how to use a smartphone, much to Arthur's amusement. By the time the sun set that day, the house was filled with a warmth and laughter that hadn't been there in years. As weeks turned into months, Evelyn remained a constant presence in their lives. She organized dinners, invited them to her home, and introduced them to her friends. Arthur and Victoria began to find joy again, not just in their new home, but in the simple act of living. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Evelyn looked at them and smiled. "Elliot would be so proud of you both," she said softly. Arthur nodded, his hand resting on the watch Evelyn now wore. "And of you," he said. "You've given us more than we ever thought we'd have again." Victoria reached for Evelyn's hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You gave us hope," she said. Evelyn shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You found it yourselves," she replied. "I just reminded you it was there." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a warm golden light, the three of them sat together, bound not by blood but by the unbreakable ties of love and resilience. The days in the new house passed like pages turning in a cherished book. Arthur and Victoria had settled into a life that, for the first time in years, felt steady. They still had their moments of sorrow, quiet reflections when Elliot's absence became a sharp ache, but those moments were now softened by the presence of Evelyn and the sense of a future they hadn't thought possible. Evelyn, as always, remained a frequent visitor. Her bond with Arthur and Victoria deepened with every shared meal, every story about Elliot, and every small laugh they managed to find together. But what none of them expected was the way their newfound happiness would ripple outward, touching people they hadn't yet met. One brisk morning, as the sun climbed lazily into the sky, Arthur shuffled out to the mailbox in front of their new home. He opened it, expecting the usual, bills, perhaps a flyer or two, but what he found instead was an envelope that stopped him cold. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Elliot's. Arthur's hand shook as he clutched the envelope, his breath catching in his chest. He stood frozen, staring at the name scrawled across the front. Dad. His mind raced with questions. How was this possible? What could it mean? Arthur, Victoria's voice called from the doorway. She stepped outside, her gaze shifting to the envelope in his hand. Her eyes widened, and she brought a hand to her mouth. Is that? Arthur nodded, unable to speak. Together they hurried back inside, the envelope still clutched tightly in Arthur's trembling hand. They sat at the small kitchen table, the envelope placed carefully in the center, as though it might shatter if touched. Evelyn, who had arrived moments earlier for a surprise visit, looked between the two of them, her expression filled with concern. What's going on? She asked. Arthur slid the envelope toward her. It's from Elliot, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn stared at it, her heart racing. She hesitated, then reached for the envelope and gently opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. She unfolded it and began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotions coursing through her. Dear Mom and Dad, if you're reading this, then something has happened, and I'm not there to explain myself. I'm sorry. I know I hurt you both, and I wish I could go back and fix all the ways I failed to tell you how much I love you. You deserved better from me. I wanted to leave you with something more than just my memory. I set up a small account before things got difficult, something I hoped might help if you ever needed it. I know it's not much, but I want you to use it for yourselves. Take a trip, fix the house, do something that makes you happy. I don't want you to spend the rest of your lives mourning me. And Dad, don't blame yourself. Mom, don't blame him either. I made my own choices, and I take responsibility for them. All I want now is for you to forgive yourselves and each other, please, for me. I love you both more than words can say. Always, Elliot. By the time Evelyn finished reading, her voice was thick with emotion. Arthur had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Victoria sat frozen, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the edge of the table. It's his handwriting, Victoria whispered, her voice filled with awe and heartbreak. It's really him. Evelyn placed the letter gently on the table, her own eyes glistening with tears. It's a gift, she said softly, a way for him to remind you that he never stopped loving you. Arthur lifted his head, his face wet with tears, but his expression lighter than it had been in years. He was always thinking of us, he said, his voice trembling, even when we thought he'd forgotten. The discovery of the letter sparked something in both Arthur and Victoria, a determination to honor Elliot's wishes. They began to talk more openly about their grief, their regrets, and their memories of their son. The house, once quiet and filled with unspoken pain, became a place of shared laughter and reflection. Evelyn, ever the steady presence, encouraged them every step of the way. She even helped them access the account Elliot had mentioned in the letter. Though it wasn't a fortune, it was enough to bring them comfort and security, a tangible reminder of Elliot's love. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Evelyn pulled out a photo album she had brought with her. It was filled with pictures of Elliot from their time together, his radiant smile, his mischievous eyes, the way he always seemed to light up a room. Arthur and Victoria pored over the photos, their emotions swinging between joy and sorrow. But as the night wore on, something shifted. They began to laugh at the memories, to share stories they hadn't told in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was filled with light. Evelyn had one final idea to help them move forward. A reunion, not just with the past, but with the future. She knew that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. And she wanted to give Arthur and Victoria a chance to fully embrace the life Elliot would have wanted for them. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said one morning as they sat together over coffee. "There's someone you need to meet." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Meet who?" Evelyn smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." She refused to say more, but the sparkle in her eyes filled them with both curiosity and anticipation. The stage was set for something extraordinary. The morning of Evelyn's planned reunion was filled with quiet anticipation. Arthur and Victoria sat side by side in their small but cozy living room, their hands clasped together. Evelyn had been uncharacteristically secretive about what she had arranged, but her excitement had been infectious. "Any idea what she's up to?" Victoria asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and nervousness. Arthur shook his head. "Whatever it is, I trust her," he said. "She hasn't let us down yet." Before they could speculate further, there was a knock at the door. Arthur rose slowly, his movements careful but steadier than they had been in months. When he opened the door, he found Evelyn standing there, her warm smile instantly putting him at ease. Behind her was a young man, tall and broad-shouldered, with bright eyes and a kind expression. He carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, but there was a softness to him, as though he understood the fragility of the moment he was about to step into. "Arthur, Victoria," Evelyn began, her voice brimming with emotion, "I'd like you to meet someone very special. This is Luke." Luke stepped forward, extending a hand toward Arthur. "It's an honor to meet you both," he said, his voice gentle but steady. Arthur shook his hand, though his confusion was evident. "Luke," he repeated slowly, "I don't understand. Who is he?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes shining with both excitement and emotion. "Luke is Elliot's son." The room fell into stunned silence. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Elliot's son?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Luke nodded, his expression tender. "I didn't know about either of you until recently," he admitted. "My mother passed away when I was a baby, and Elliot, my dad, he left before I was old enough to remember him, but he made sure I was taken care of. And now, thanks to Evelyn, I've found you." Arthur's legs felt weak, and he sank slowly into the nearest chair, his head spinning. "Elliot never told us," he murmured. "We had no idea." Victoria's tears began to flow freely, but they weren't just tears of sadness. There was joy in them, too, a sudden, overwhelming sense of connection that she hadn't felt in years. "You look so much like him," she said, her voice trembling. Luke smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "I've been told that before," he said, "but I think the resemblance is more than just looks. My dad, he left pieces of himself in both of you, and I'm here because I want to know him, through you." The hours that followed were filled with stories, laughter, and tears. Arthur and Victoria told Luke everything they could about Elliot, the way he'd light up a room with his smile, his stubborn streak that made him both infuriating and endearing, his dreams of a life full of meaning. Luke listened intently, soaking in every detail. He shared what little he knew of Elliot from his mother's stories and expressed his gratitude for the chance to finally meet his father's family. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with joy as the three of them bonded. She knew this moment was more than just a reunion, it was a second chance. A chance for Arthur and Victoria to fill the void Elliot had left behind, and for Luke to build a connection he had always longed for. That evening, Evelyn joined them for dinner. The house, which had once been so quiet and filled with sorrow, now echoed with laughter and the clinking of dishes. It was a simple meal, but it felt like a celebration of life, love, and the connections that time could never truly erase. In the days and weeks that followed, Luke became a regular part of Arthur and Victoria's lives. He visited often, helping Arthur in the garden or listening to Victoria's stories over tea. He even began helping Arthur with small projects around the house, determined to make their lives as comfortable as possible. One afternoon, as Luke and Arthur sat together on the porch, Arthur handed him something that had become deeply meaningful: Elliot's watch. "This belonged to your father," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "He gave it to me when he thought I needed it most. Now, I think it's time for you to have it." Luke hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he took the watch. He ran his fingers over the worn leather strap and the scratched face, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll take care of it." Arthur smiled, a deep sense of peace settling over him. "It's not about the watch," he said. "It's about remembering who he was. And you remind us of him every day." Evelyn, though she remained a constant presence in their lives, knew when it was time to step back. One evening, as she prepared to leave after another shared dinner, Arthur stopped her at the door. "You've given us more than we ever thought possible," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "We were lost, and you brought us back. You gave us a reason to hope again." Evelyn smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "You had it in you all along," she said. "I just helped you see it." As she walked down the quiet street, the stars twinkling above her, Evelyn felt a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. She had lost Elliot, but she had found something just as precious: a family, a purpose, and a renewed belief in the power of love and kindness. Inside the house, Arthur, Victoria, and Luke sat together, flipping through an old photo album and sharing stories late into the night. The house was filled with warmth, not just from the glowing lamps, but from the love that now bound them all together. Elliot's absence would always be felt, but his legacy had become something greater. A reminder that even in the face of loss, life has a way of bringing us back to each other.